Edit audio.
Since this podcast has aired, we've had some people reach out to us, possibly with new information or a willingness to be interviewed, and provided it's valid, we'll be adding a bonus episode. This episode contains scenes of sexual violence and extreme violence. It may not be suitable for all listeners.
When you got people like that living in your community, that's got to be a pretty strong suspect. And I'm thinking if there were other people who were more of a suspect living in Springfield during that time, I'd like to know who they are. But that's the kind of person who has the makings of a serial killer.
In the last episode of the Springfield Three.
And the leads that had come in early on, the van, then through the years they wondered, was there even really a van? But one woman remembered seeing a blonde girl who looked frightened driving a van, being told something. And that became a lead. And for a while, there weren't theories or that they spoke about because really they were running around the city.
So here's where we left off. The entire town now knows about the three missing women. Search and rescue has been sent to comb the region, and there are thousands of tips that have since been phoned into the police. There was the gas station clerk who said he saw the women that night. And there was a waitress at Georgia's Steakhouse who reported seeing the women with three men between 1 and 3 a.m. And there was the van, a theory that just about anyone who was alive in that town during the time would remember. Even with a replica of the van parked outside the Springfield Police Department, there were no solid leads. There was the story that we heard from Barrett Fisk about a kid who saw and heard the women in what locals call the Girl Scout camp. And after some digging, Barrett told us that one of the men took his own life.
They were watching from a distance. It was dark. The perpetrators didn't see them, but the women were taken and loaded back into the van. The guy says he was 15 when it happened. Chuck would have been, I believe, 17. Something terrifying to see as an adolescent.
And there were the parking lots, both of the Mega Western store and that of the hospital, where a lot of people in this town still think the women can be found. But then again, there are a lot who don't.
But, I look at some of these theories, like the Cox parking lot theory, would require that somebody held the bodies for several months before they were able to dump them in a parking lot with nobody noticing. That just doesn't really seem. Or the theory that they were buried underneath a business as it was growing and expanding. Again, it goes back to what's the simplest thought. Somebody wanted them. Somebody wanted at least one of them and took them and killed them.
This is the Springfield Three, and I'm your host, Ann Roderick Jones. This is a podcast about the disappearance of three women who forever changed a small Missouri town and the people in it. On the last episode, we started looking at suspects, including Cheryl's son and Susie's brother, Bart Streeter. There's Susie's boyfriend, Dustin, and his friends Michael and Joseph, who were arrested for breaking into a mausoleum and stealing gold fillings from the corpses' mouths. Here's Darrell Moore. He was the chief assistant prosecuting attorney for Greene County in 1992.
Well, in the very beginning, Susie's boyfriend and a couple other guys had been involved in robbing a grave and removing, as I recall, I think it was gold fillings from a skull. They ended up charged. I think Susie helped provide information to law enforcement to resolve that case. One of the speculations always was that this was retaliation against Susie for turning the three of the men in for the grave robbery incident. And so in the beginning, that looked to be promising, even though everyone kind of thought, that's kind of drastic to kill your girlfriend on turning you in on robbing a grave. And they were brought in question.
These initial suspects raised some valid questions. Could 3 high school kids get away with the seamless disappearance of 3 healthy women when they couldn't even pull off a grave robbery? Could the women be buried underneath a parking lot in a hospital that's surrounded by a 24-hour emergency room with constant activity? After months of reporting and without any successful leads, law enforcement and local journalists started looking towards offenders of violent crimes. Ron Davis is a journalist, and he covered the case at the time. He's been thinking about who could have done this for over 20 years.
All right, boys and girls, what did we miss in the first go-around that is obvious in our face? And let's not go all fanciful. Let's just really look at what we know about predators, serial killers, men who kill. That's the other thing. We know it wasn't a woman. A woman didn't kill these 3. Women didn't kill these 3. It wasn't an African American. It was a white guy or white guys who killed them. So let's look at that and not look at the just same old tired suspects, but let's really look at who could have possibly done this and gotten away with it. Not the Robb family who's doing chop shops, but people who could have gotten away with that. And using that theory, it really does come down to just 2 or 3 or 4 people.
There have been a ton of theories about potential suspects, but of all the people we spoke to, these are the names that kept coming up. The first of these 4 people is Steve Garrison. He's serving 40 years in prison for raping, sodomizing, and terrorizing a female college student in Springfield, Missouri in the summer of 1993, just a year after the women went missing. And on August 28, 1993, information from an informant led police to Webster County, Missouri.
This is where police, I think, had a real problem because there was a trial of a guy named Steve Garrison that happened years afterwards. And Garrison was truly a bad guy.
It was Steve Garrison who told police that a friend had confessed to killing the 3 women during a party.
But they thought he had some information, and so they helped spring him from jail, the police did.
And it was this information that led investigators to serve 3 search warrants at 2 sites in Webster County, where investigators were told they would find the women's bodies and clues about their abduction and deaths. The women's bodies weren't found, but it wouldn't be the last time we hear about Webster County. Robert Keyes was a journalist who was at that dig.
And I think actually Garrison may have led the police to think that, Rob knew something about this, or you could find evidence on Rob. Now, I don't know this for fact, so I'm speaking out of turn a little bit in terms of the accuracy of who said what to who that made this a legitimate lead. But, the cops, and I remember they did a dig on this old nasty farm out in somewhere, I think it was in Webster County, and it was all day and it led into the night, and these investigators would come out occasionally and talk to us, and they didn't have anything to say. There was nothing there. Just nothing there.
And to add to the eerie nature of this case,
and somehow he slipped their custody at the hotel and ended up brutalizing a woman.
Here's Robert Keyes again.
He slipped away from them, right? He was in their custody and he slipped away and he got away. And in that time, he went out and broke into a house and raped a woman. He was ultimately found and arrested, and he went to trial and was convicted for that rape. But it became a hell of a story, quite frankly, because it was like, suspect in the missing woman's case who had slipped away from the police and then raped a woman. It was a pretty big deal. It was a pretty big story. So it was such an embarrassment to the police, I'm sure. And it was just another tragic aspect of this horrible situation. But again, it's just one of those things that this story has had a lot of really benign trails that it led down, but also some kind of tragic ones. And that was probably one of the more tragic trails, I'd say.
His public defender at the time had such great disdain for Garrison. He put up a great defense, but he had great disdain for him. And his whole point was, I don't even think you're smart enough to have anything to do with this. You talk a good tough game like, oh, you know all this information. You're just an idiot. You couldn't have pulled off that crime. You got caught raping one woman. And you're telling me you got away with killing 3 women and taking care of their bodies? Not going to happen.
Steve Garrison denied an interview for this podcast. Another potential suspect is Larry DeWayne Hall. Hall's a serial killer who's suspected of murdering between 39 and 54 women, 14 of which he either confessed to or the body's been found, and Hall's the main suspect. Just to give you an idea of how violent this man was, in 1987, Larry DeWayne Hall started his killing spree, and during his crimes as a serial killer, he was known to commit acts of necrophilia, torture, strangulation, stalking, rape, mutilation, and murder. And he would keep personal items from the victims after he committed the crime. Larry was living with his parents at a house in Wabash, Indiana, about 8 hours from Springfield. Larry and his twin brother Gary were big Civil War buffs who traveled to the Springfield area often for reenactments. Larry had driven to Missouri several times over the years. It's been reported that the twins visited Battlefield, Missouri in the summer of 1991 for the 130th anniversary reenactment of the Battle of Wilson's Creek. Remember, Battlefield is where the graduation parties took place. It's not unrealistic to think that he could have returned again in the summer of 1992. Perhaps the most interesting detail about Hall is that despite having confessed to multiple violent crimes, he's never been convicted of murder. That being said, he's currently serving life imprisonment for kidnapping. Hall denied an interview. So it seems clear that Steve Garrison and Larry Hall are capable of kidnapping 3 women, and I certainly don't want to discount them as suspects in this case. But I want to switch gears and tell you about 2 other potential suspects.
It really does come down to just 2 or 3 or 4 people. Carnahan, Cox. Okay, it comes down to a couple of people, actually. Not very many other people could have gotten away with this.
The first is Gerald Carnahan and the story of Jackie Johns.
They were looking more into was it Jerry Carnahan? Was it anybody else that we suspect of being a terrible monster or a killer? And I bring up Carnahan only because he was perhaps one of the leading theories at the time. We had the Jackie Johns case in the mid-'80s, where he was the prime suspect.
On June 18th of 1985, a beauty queen named Jackie Johns disappeared. Johns was a 20-year-old waitress from Nixa, Missouri, just a few minutes outside of Springfield. When Jackie Johns' disappearance was brought to national attention, volunteers and local law enforcement scoured the area between Springfield and Nixa. Researching this case felt eerily parallel to the Springfield Three. Johns' black Camaro was found in a convenience store parking lot with her bloodied clothing found in the back seat. 4 days later, on June 22, 1985, 2 fishermen found Johns' body in Lake Springfield. The prime suspect, local businessman Gerald Carnahan, who was immediately brought in for questioning. Witnesses reported seeing Carnahan's truck at the 7-Eleven gas station where Johns was last seen. And while he said he knew the woman, he claimed to be at a bar with his stepdaughter that night. But investigators long believed that Carnahan raped and beat 20-year-old Jackie Johns on that night in June of 1985, and then dumped her body in Lake Springfield. Law enforcement immediately started looking at Carnahan as a suspect, but didn't have sufficient evidence to charge him. In 1993, he was convicted of attempting kidnapping an 18-year-old girl in Springfield and sentenced to 2 years in a state prison, though he'd soon get out on bond. Carnahan later tried to pick a young woman up on the side of the road, and before his sentence even began, he pleaded guilty to burglary, stealing, and arson for a separate incident. And while this case had a body, DNA wasn't available at the time of Johns' death, and like the Springfield Three, it went cold. It wasn't until August of 2007, that's 22 years after the murder of Jackie Johns, when a Missouri Highway Patrol trooper assigned to the case was able to provide authorities with the DNA evidence to link Gerald Carnahan to the crime. Gerald Carnahan is a man who got away with murder for 22 years. He tried picking up an 18-year-old girl off the side of the road and later raped and killed a 20-year-old woman. Could he have been the one to take Cheryl, Susie, and Stacy? Darrell Moore was the prosecutor on this case.
There was really never any strong evidence indicating that Gerald Carnahan had had anything to do with the 3 missing women. And I will tell you that some of us believe, but if you look at what Gerald did in terms of Jackie Johns, it was actually sloppy. And I think some of us are skeptical that Gerald, at least Gerald by himself, could have been organized enough to take all 3 women.
Ron Davis reported on Gerald Carnahan's case and remembers him well.
I got to know him over the course of reporting on different stories. He and I went out to lunch one time in the middle of one of his trials, and we were driving around in his Cadillac, and I'm lording it over other reporters because I'm having lunch with Jerry. They're not. And he goes, "You know what, man? Ron, I just like driving around and checking out the countryside. Wouldn't it be great if we could just drive around?" And then he talked about his travels to South America for his family's business. And he goes, "It's amazing. You can go there and there's some villages out in the middle of nowhere." And you think, dude, I'd love to know where you've traveled, because I think wherever you've traveled, there are people who went missing. And while he's a guttural human being and clearly a murderer, that just seemed a little bit out of his wheelhouse. He would have killed them right there. And Jerry's crime with Jackie Johns in the 80s, there was a terrible crime scene just within her car. So he wasn't the sort of person who would smooth talk somebody or kidnap them and keep them and be careful. He was more of a dissociative killer than anything else.
And there's someone else, someone who could possibly be pivotal to this case. His story is equally as disturbing as Gerald Carnahan's. This is the story of Robert Craig Cox.
Robert Craig Cox.
Robert Craig Cox.
Of course, the big theory, a man named Robert Craig Cox.
According to Florida court documents, on December 30th of 1979, 19-year-old Sharon Zellers disappeared after leaving work at Walt Disney World. It was reported that Zellers was in the habit of always telling her parents her whereabouts. She was diligent about calling them, not unlike Stacy McCall, reporting to her mom Janice and dad Stu. At the end of her shift at Disney, Zellers called her parents as usual to let them know she was meeting friends for breakfast and promised to call when she returned from the restaurant. But she never did. 4 days later, Sharon Zellers' abandoned car was discovered in an orange grove in Orange County, Florida. And the following day, her body was discovered, fully submerged in a sewage lift station that was close to the orange grove. Sharon Zellers' body was heavily decomposed, and she was identified by her dental records. A medical examiner testified that she had died from blunt force trauma to the head and reported that she had received 14 separate head wounds. Despite Ms. Zellers' injuries, the examiner reported that she probably lived 20 to 30 minutes after the attack. On that same night, the night that Zellers disappeared, Robert Craig Cox, a 19-year-old Army Ranger, was staying with his parents at a Days Inn hotel in Florida. They were visiting from California. Cox's mother had called security that night because her son had returned to the motel and he was bloody around his face and mouth. A portion of his tongue had been severed off, and he was unable to talk and had to communicate by writing. Here's David Asher, a retired detective.
Initially, we received a call from a family in Florida about their daughter who was kidnapped, raped, and killed in Florida. And a man by the last name of Cox, I believe it's Robert Cox, and he currently is in Plano, Texas, but in Florida, where this crime happened, he was subsequently arrested. The victim had bit off the end of his tongue.
Cox passed out and was transported to the emergency room by an ambulance, where emergency surgery was performed to repair his damaged tongue. A couple of weeks after the incident, Cox made a statement to officers and claimed that he was injured during a fight at a local skating rink. He stated that there was a fight involving multiple people outside, and after he was hit in the face, he bit his own tongue. He claimed that he then got into his own car and left the scene. But he couldn't find the hotel, so he went back to the skating rink, where a good Samaritan picked him up and dropped him off at the hotel. The Days Inn, where Robert and his parents were staying, was located just over 300 feet from where Sharon Zellers' body was discovered. Detectives found 3 loose hairs in the victim's car that were consistent with Cox's hair and type O blood, which was the same type as Cox's, but not the victim's. A military-type boot was discovered inside the car. Cox was in the Army at the time of his arrest and was wearing the exact type of boot when he was treated at the hospital. A match, however, has never been made linking the 2 prints together. Here's what happened in court. Medical evidence was presented that an artery in Cox's tongue had been severed, and he was bleeding profusely from the mouth. There was a trail of blood at the day's inn, leading from the second floor to the third floor. A surgical assistant testified at the trial that the injury to Cox's tongue was more consistent with someone other than himself biting off his tongue because of the shape of the wound and the ragged tear. The defense brought up the fact that the missing portion of Cox's tongue wasn't discovered in the victim's mouth or even near the victim. The state then countered that the victim's body was severely decomposed as a result of being submerged in human waste. Therefore, the tongue may not have been able to be discovered. Cox was not convicted of the murder of Sharon Zellers yet. According to a Florida police report in August of 1985, a young girl named Kathleen Boyce arrived at her house in Crestview, California. As she exited her vehicle, Cox, who was following her, jumped from his car, grabbed the victim, and threw her to the ground. He placed a knife to her throat and told her, "Go with me, don't scream or I'll kill you." During this assault, the knife cut the victim's hand. In December of 1985, Gidget Wickham was stationed at the U.S. Army in California. Miss Wickham went to the airport to retrieve luggage, and as she was leaving, Cox asked her for a ride to the base. She complied, and en route, Cox drew a firearm on her and told her they weren't driving to the base but to the mountains. The woman was able to convince Cox to stop by a friend's home, where he was arrested by police. Robert Craig Cox was then convicted and sentenced to 9 years in a Tracy, California prison. An Orange County, Florida detective got wind of the convictions, and Cox was brought back to Florida to stand trial for the murder of Sharon Zellers. 11 years later, in 1998, Cox was convicted and sentenced to death for the murder of Sharon Zellers. Possibly fate, or the judicial system, is on the side of Robert Craig Cox. As Cox sat on death row, awaiting the execution for the death of Sharon Zellers, the Florida Supreme Court ruled that there was not enough evidence and reversed the conviction. Robert Craig Cox became a free man. So just to wrap my head around all of this, Robert Craig Cox is convicted of abducting and assaulting 2 women. He was then placed at the scene of Zellers' murder, which he later became convicted of, and he was released. So why does all of this matter? And how does it even relate to the Springfield Three, aside from the fact that all of Cox's victims were young, pretty, thin women? Robert Craig Cox grew up in Springfield, Missouri, and in the year of 1991, he moved back from California, freshly released from prison, to Springfield. And when he moved back to his hometown, it's rumored that Robert Craig Cox went to work at a car dealership for Stuart McCall, Stacy McCall's father.
Though there was never any indication that they met each other, and this was a huge car lot, so you could work in different areas and never see that. We know that Stacy had been up to the car lot, but there's nothing in any of the reports to indicate that they ever came across each other, but certainly it's something that triggers some thought.
From 1991, that's 1 year prior to when the women went missing, to 1995, Cox bounced around, working odd jobs and basically avoiding prison. And while Cox could have been a likely suspect for this case, he had an alibi for the night the women went missing. And here's what it was. Cox was with his girlfriend at church the morning the women disappeared. And Cox's girlfriend corroborated this statement. Here's Robert Keyes again.
He had an alibi, but it wasn't a strong alibi. And I would love to know what his parents and his ex-girlfriend would have to say even today about that alibi and what they think.
In the meantime, Cox was arrested in Texas for aggravated robbery, and it was while he was in custody that he declared he believed the Springfield Three were dead, and whoever did it was someone who knew what they were doing. And then, his girlfriend recanted her statement, and Robert Craig Cox lost his alibi for the night of June 6, 1992. So people, especially journalists, became interested in Cox.
God, he fit the profile. And in today's world, he absolutely fits the profile, right? He'd been convicted of a random abduction murder in Florida, which he was released on a technicality, circumstantial evidence. He had, previous to that, randomly abducted 2 women in California. He was a guy who took women he didn't know. When you got people like that living in your community, that's got to be a pretty strong suspect.
Robert Keyes interviewed Cox, who told him that he knew the women were murdered. They were buried in Springfield, and they would never be found. And here's the strange part. Cox stated to authorities and journalists that he would disclose what happened to the 3 women after his mother died.
So again, I hate to try to crawl inside the head of Robert Craig Cox, but I will tell you that when I interviewed him, he was a very interesting guy. It was almost like the conversation was like a chess match. He wasn't forthcoming about a lot of things, and he was just shy of being honest about things. I shouldn't say honest, but just shy of being revealing, forthcoming. It was kind of like it was a game. He would say things like, he lived his life on the edge. He knew that the police were coming to talk to him. And he made it really clear. He knew that the cops wanted to talk to him. He just didn't know when they were going to come. But in my mind, he was a strong suspect. And he was just, he was an Army Ranger. He was a lieutenant. I think he was like a Soldier of the Year. So he was one of those guys who really learned how to handle difficult situations. And the fact that he'd been accused and convicted of random crimes against women, it just all adds up into pointing a finger at a guy who, in my mind, was as strong a suspect as has ever emerged in this case.
In 1996, 3 years after the women went missing, KY3 investigative reporter Dennis Graves traveled to a Texas prison to interview Robert Craig Cox. The interview was subpoenaed by authorities and presented before a grand jury that never handed down any charges. I emailed Dennis Graves in hopes to get an interview. I wanted to hear more about his interview with Robert Craig Cox. To be honest, I've had a hard time getting in touch with a lot of people involved in this case. Some because they're older and some are retired. There are some involved who have died, and then there are those who no longer want to talk about this. But Dennis Graves promptly emailed me back. And here's what he said. Anne, I retired from the news business 18 years ago after 58 years of reporting on hundreds of heartbreaking tragedies. I've since worked hard to find myself in a world of anonymity without cameras where I can go to the hardware store in dirty clothes or dinner with my lovely wife without being recognized. I'm now experiencing true privacy for the first time in my adult life. I hope you understand why I must decline your kind offer. I get an uncomfortable, long-forgotten feeling in my gut when I think about revisiting that never-ending story. He signed off by asking me to tell Janice McCall that he still prayed for her, and then ended with this. One suggestion: focus on Robert Craig Cox. I'm still convinced he's the only living person who can tell the final chapter. Respectfully, Dennis Graves. On the next episode of the Springfield Three, we dig into where the investigation went wrong.
And of course, that was an incident where I think the chief took one of the suspects out for a cheeseburger at McDonald's, and based on that conversation decided that they were non-suspects.
The Springfield Three is an Edit Audio original production created in collaboration with Ann Roderick Jones. The series is written, researched, and hosted by Ann Roderick Jones. It was produced and edited by Ali Siawa, with executive producing from Steph Colburn, Sophie Shin, and with lots of help from the rest of the amazing Edit Audio team. Theme music was written by Patrick Grindle and Ali Siawa and was produced by Patrick Grindle at Studio Dolly. And thank you to all of those who share their stories with us. This project would not be possible without you.